Alright, welcome to the last video of SPSS Inferential Statistics, video 6, where we're going to learn how we perform Pearson's product moment correlation coefficient in SPSS. And just a reminder, correlation coefficient is when we're testing the direction and strength of an association, a relationship, correlation between two quantitative variables. So we can use ordinal variables that we can make sense of a mean standard deviation, and then we have interval and ratio variables. We want to see what is the relationship between these two variables. Is it significantly related? Is there a significant association? So for example, we ask students, how many hours of exercise do you engage in per week? And then we wanted to see, is that significantly correlated to the number of zombies that they encounter? So steps 1 and steps 2. State the null hypothesis. Well, there is no association or relationship or correlation between our two variables. So in this case, there is no association between the number of hours exercised and the number of zombies encountered. Or there's no relationship between these two variables. Or there's no correlation between the number of hours exercised and the number of zombies encountered. Stating alternative hypothesis is simply stating that there is an association or a relationship or a correlation between our two variables. So there is a relationship between the number of hours exercised and the number of zombies encountered. Notice we're not hypothesizing any direction here. We're just simply stating non-directional research hypotheses here. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we would perform correlation coefficient in SPSS. We're going to go to Analyze. But because we're not comparing any groups, we're not doing compare means, we're going to go to correlate because we're going to do correlations. And we have two variables, so we're doing a bivariate correlation test. Okay, so let's go ahead and run our test. So we go to Analyze, Correlate, Bivariate. Now we want to go ahead and select what our two variables are. Notice that we just have one box, variables. So it's really just looking at what are the variables that you want to test the relationships in. And in fact, we can actually do multiple variables. Remember when we first learned about correlation coefficient in chapter 5, we learned about how we can look at multiple relationships between variables in one correlation matrix. So in fact, we can actually look at multiple variables here by just selecting more than two variables. But in this case, we just want to look at the relationship between number of hours exercised and the number of zombies that students encounter. So we're going to go ahead and select both of those and move them over to our variables. Let's go ahead and take a look at our options. And we want to go ahead and get some statistics here, some descriptive statistics, some means and standard deviations. So let's select that and then click on Continue. We see we have different types of correlation coefficients. We have Pearson's. We also have Spearman's rank. Remember that guy? And then we have Kendall's Tau B. This is a type that is a little bit more advanced than our introductory statistics course. But pretty much by default, you're going to be doing Pearson's correlation coefficient. However, if you decide to use ordinal variables, this is where you should select Spearman's instead. Okay, so let's go ahead for this purpose, since we have both interval ratio variables here, true quantitative variables, let's go ahead and select Pearson's. And because we're doing a non-directional test, we're going to go ahead and do two-tailed test. And look at that. SPSS is even going to be even nice to us and flag significant correlations to help us figure out where are those significant relationships. So let's click on OK. And we look at our output table. We see we have our correlations, and then we have our two tables. Our first one is our descriptive statistics, where it gives us our mean and standard deviation for both of our variables and also our sample size. And this is what we chose when we did our options. If we didn't select that, we wouldn't know what the mean standard deviations are for both of these variables. So it's important for us to remember to select that option whenever we're running this type of analysis. And so our second table, this is really our correlation table, and we've seen this before. Right, we've seen that here are our ones, which is essentially the same variable looking at each other, exercise and exercise, and zombies and zombies. And so we can look at either one of these two cells to look at the relationship between exercise and zombies encountered. So we have our Pearson's correlation coefficient, little r, negative 0.445. We see our sample size of 20, and now, because we know what sig means, we know what our p-value is, now we can look at this number here, 0.049. And this is less than our alpha, 0.05, which is why there's a little asterisk here. And this asterisk tells us correlation is significant at the 0.05 level, two-tailed test. So it's telling us that the relationship between these two variables is significant. And then we can go ahead and interpret Pearson's correlation coefficient, or little r, in terms of direction and strength. So we have our r, and then we've made our decision by looking at our p-value and comparing that to alpha. So let's go ahead and finish up with step 5. So there was a significant moderate and indirect association between the number of hours exercised and zombies encountered. The amount of exercise accounted for 19.8% of the variance in the number of zombies encountered. So we see that we're listing the direction, indirect, as well as the strength, moderate. We're also listing the mean and standard deviations for both of the variables. We're also listing a correlation coefficient, a test statistic, R. We also have our p-value, and we're also going to list our degrees of freedom, which we'll learn about when we learn about correlation coefficients some more. And since we found significant relationship between these two variables, we go ahead and calculate and report our coefficient of determination. So just to summarize correlation coefficient, again, we know our correlation coefficients, little r, range from -1 to +1. We always report our mean and standard deviations, our test statistic, degrees of freedom, and p-value, and if significant, if there's a significant relationship, report the direction, the strength of the relationship, and calculate and interpret r squared. So now we know, the more you exercise, the more likely you're not going to encounter more zombies compared to somebody who doesn't exercise as much, probably won't be able to get away from them. Alright, well, congratulations. You are officially part of the zombie outbreak response team now that you know how to increase your fellow classmates' survival on campus. So our overall summary, we've seen how we can apply the 5 steps of hypothesis testing using SPSS. Remember, step 3 is calculating our test statistic, step 4 is making your decision, and then step 5 is then really looking at stating our conclusions, where we use our descriptive statistics in addition to our test statistics to really help us describe and answer our research question. We always report means, standard deviations, your test statistic, p-values, and degrees of freedom. And then if there are significant differences or relationships found, you then need to look at other output. For independent and paired samples t-tests, report the mean differences and the effect size. For chi-square, look at your residuals. For ANOVA, look at Tukey's test and report your effect size. Correlation coefficient, report your direction, strength of the relationship, and then also your coefficient of determination. Again, the point of this whole lectures and all of these 6 videos is really just for you to know how to go ahead and click through SPSS so that you can perform these analyses for your upcoming assignments.